Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the latest episode of our Risk and Regulation news channel. Today, we will have a look at two most interesting topics, the ECB SREP results for the year 2022 and also the ECB's supervisory priorities for the years 2023 to 2025. Two very interesting topics, which for me makes all this feel like Christmas and Easter combined in one day. And before we start with the SREP results of last year, I would like to hand over to my colleague Carole, who is here today from Brussels.
Thank you, Stefan. It's always a pleasure to be in Frankfurt. So the ECB has published their SREP result for 2022, and you know that it's the supervisory exercise that gives a view on the expectation and what the ECB sees as the risks faced by the banks and how they manage it. And what we see is that for this new cycle, 2022, the overall capital requirements and scoring remain roughly the same, with the overall capital requirements reaching on average 15% against 14.7 last year. And what we see also is that well, in spite of this economic turmoil that we know and the overall crisis, we see that there is some kind of stability, which is a positive sign to the banking industry. Still, we also see that the number of qualitative measures, so the measures that the ECB is asking the banks to put in place to mitigate some of the risks identified, have risen by 14%, with overall 95% of the banks that are in scope of the ECB supervision being targeted with mitigation measures and qualitative measures. What we also see is that, and very similarly to last year and prior exercises, there are categories of risks that the ECB deem to be the most important or areas in which they would like to see banks improve. And we have internal governance that represents close to a third of the qualitative measures, credit risk, that is a category that is improving, but still represent close to 20% of the mitigating measures, and capital adequacy that remains stable, but we will see later on that there are some divergences in the way banks are requested to approach things. What we see also is that, and we will have a chance to discuss that a bit later, is that these findings are very much aligned and food for the supervisory priorities that we will discuss.
So let us have a look at the results in a bit more detail, and we start here with the topics business model and internal governance and risk management. And when we look to business model, and as Carole already pointed out, while the overall results did not change too much as compared to the last few years, the qualitative statements that go along with these results have seen some new perspectives, like, for example, the return of net interest income driven by the inflation and the interest rate rises over the last year, something that everybody was more or less expecting and that now has finally happened, though for other reasons than everybody would have assumed. And while this is, of course, positive news for the banking sector and shows an increased profitability of most banks, on the other hand side, this, of course, must not deflect from the fact that there are still long-standing structural issues from which many banks suffer and where the ECB is still putting their finger on and ask the banks to continue working on these topics, like, for example, the very slow digitalization in the banking sector. And this brings us directly to the next topic, which is internal governance and risk management, because also completely in line with the messages from the last few years, the slow response to digitalization, the slow response to cybersecurity threats is blamed directly from the ECB on the bank's boards, which in the expectation of the ECB need to do more to address these topics. And we can see this in very, very harsh SREP scores, with roughly 3/4 of all banks scoring 3 or 4 and hardly any banks scoring a 1 or 2 in the internal governance SREP assessment. Having said that, we then look to the other two elements, which are credit risk and capital adequacy.
Yes, indeed. As I mentioned earlier, credit risk is one of the key focus area also of the ECB. And well, we all know that the banks are facing a lot of significant turmoils with the crisis, the energy crisis, the war. What we see is that on the one hand, there has been a very positive management of non-performing exposures, and globally the situation has not deteriorated as much as we thought it would. But the scoring remains very stable because we don't know what's going to happen next, and the environment is very unstable. What we also see is that the ECB flags a series of persisting internal risk control deficiencies. And what they mean by that is that they are worried that the internal processes among the banks, in order to identify, mitigate, provision the credit risk, are not sufficient, but also lagging potentially a bit of attention to the independent control functions on the risk side, which means that the concerns remain quite high, and we see that with the fact that there's a lot of qualitative measures focusing, more than a third of the qualitative measures in credit risk focus on these processes, identification of the right metrics, but also data reporting and aggregation. That remains across the board a weakness in the banks. And we see here that there's a big difference between the different business models of the banks. On the one hand, we see that the smaller banks, the diversified lenders, tend to be in a weak category with more than 70% of them scoring 3 and 4. And also a big part of the globally systemically important banks scoring 3, which is not a great category either. On the capital adequacy side, well, we see that the capital position of the banks globally improved, and the scores remain very stable, with 92% of the banks keeping the same scores as last year. Still, the ECB points out that they do have a bit of concern concerning the possibilities that some banks are not in a position to produce reliable capital projections. And obviously, capital projections are key in managing and steering a banking organization. And that's why we see when the measures that are targeted for capital adequacy mostly go through the ICAP, the internal capital adequacy plans. And we see that a lot of them are focused on the capital planning, the risk aggregation. Here again, we see data coming up as a key weak points in the bank, but also their ability to produce reliable stress testing scenarios and stress tests overall. And here again, we see that there is a big difference between the different business models as seen by the ECB. So that's it for the results. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can walk us through a bit the priorities of the ECB?
Yes, sure, happy to do so. And you will, of course, realize when looking at the supervisory priorities that a lot of the topics that we have just addressed also appear here as part of the priorities. This starts, for example, with the first priority, that is strengthening the resilience to macro-financial and political shocks. That was, in the last few years, always tagged to the COVID topic, and now, of course, is much more strongly driven by the crisis in Ukraine. And this, of course, impacts banks. On the one hand side, it's good to see that there is net interest income back again. But on the other hand side, this, of course, means that in particular, highly leveraged borrowers might feel the pressure, may default in the future, and that this will, on the one hand side, put pressure on banks and also requires them to step up their credit risk management. Also, it might mean that banks have to further diversify their funding sources, because the increase in interest expense also means that they have to look for additional sources and maybe even cheaper sources of funding. Then we have as the second priority addressing digitalization and strengthening the management body's steering committee capabilities, something which I've mentioned before, and something that is, I will not say copy and paste from last year, but a recurring topic within the ECB's supervisory priorities. And finally, we have the efforts to address climate change. And here I can once again quote the ECB saying that the glass is not even half full. Also a topic where the ECB has, in the last few years, time and again, asked banks to become better, to do more, to address this most important topic. Now, having provided that overview, Carole, is there any single topic that you would like to comment on?
I think there are two that are very interesting, although we did not receive really very detailed results, SREP results on these two. On the one hand, everything that relates to operational risk, non-financial risks, and the ECB flags that it's one of the categories where they see that the weakest SREP scores across the board, and it relates mostly to IT security, cyber security, but also the way the banks manage their third-party relationship, outsourcing arrangements. And one interesting fact is that external fraud rose quite a lot, with the operational losses linked to fraud events growing also. And I think it's interesting to see that on the one hand it's on the topic, it's at a topic of the ECB, but also we have a major regulatory changes upcoming that will change the landscape, specifically regarding IT security, but also outsourcing and service providers, with among others the DORA package. And the last point is, I think, very important, as you mentioned, climate risk is very high on the agenda, and it's the first time that across the different risk categories, the ECB has mentioned specifically measures, and there are about 40 specific qualitative measures imposed to banks on climate risk management, including how they quantify their risk exposures, but also how they put in place the right governance arrangements. So these are also very important topics on which the banks will face scrutiny, because we know that when the ECB says it's a priority, it's accompanied by on-site inspections with impact on the banks.
Yes, and that is why I'm sure we will have much more to say on each of these topics in our next episodes of the Risk and Regulatory News channel. Thank you very much, Carole, for coming over to Frankfurt to record this session. And thank you very much to all of you who still continue to view us on YouTube. Go ahead, share the link. You will find many more interesting news channel episodes here in the time to come. Thank you very much.